Let's take a look at depth of field in aperture. How open or closed down the lens is has a major impact on the depth of field. The more the lens is closed down, the higher the f-stop number, the larger is the area of sharp focus, DOF. The more wide open the lens, small f-stop number, the smaller the area of sharp focus. Let's look at several examples of shallow depth of field. Note the aperture settings on each photograph. The lens in each of them is quite wide open. Now let's look at several examples of broad depth of field. Note the aperture settings on each photograph show that the lens is closed down greatly, if not all the way. Here again you see the chart that we've referred to several times, which can help you figure out the relationship between the f-stop, the shutter speed, and the ISO, and also you can note the presence of digital noise as you increase the ISO, and you can note the amount of blur as the lens opens further. Technically, the focal length of a lens is the distance from the rear of the lens to the image it forms on the focal plane when the lens is focused at infinity. Lenses have different focal lengths, usually mentioned in millimeters. For example, a 50 millimeter lens is a lens with a focal length of 50 millimeters. Lenses below roughly 50 millimeters, taken as the analog to normal human visual focal length, are called wide-angle lenses and have a relatively large depth of field. Lenses above 50 millimeters are called telephoto lenses and have a relatively more shallow depth of field. Let's look at depth of field and focal length of lenses in some images. As I said, lenses below roughly 50 millimeters, analog to normal human vision focal length, are called wide and ultra-wide angle lenses. They have a relatively broad depth of field. These shots are all taken at 1/100th of a second, and the f-stop is f16. Notice in the 16 millimeter lens panel and 30 millimeter panel how both depth of field and perspective are affected by the lens. Lenses above 50 millimeters are called telephoto lenses and have a relatively more shallow depth of field. These shots are all taken at 1/100th of a second, and the f-stop is f16. Notice in the 100 millimeter panel how both depth of field and perspective are affected by the lens. Now, look at one subject taken with lenses of 3 different focal lengths: the ultra-wide 16 millimeter, the normal 50 millimeter, and the telephoto 145 millimeter. Check how the perspective and depth of field are different from the 50 millimeter in both the ultra-wide 16 millimeter and the telephoto 145 millimeter. So again, to summarize, the wider the lens, the greater the depth of field, and the longer the lens, the shallower the depth of field. Note the focal lengths affect both the depth of field and the perspective. Longer lenses compress perspective. Distant objects appear closer to the foreground. This partly explains why long lenses are often used for portraits, as the compression and flattening are thought to show the facial features more desirably. Wide-angle lenses produce steep perspective. More elements of background are visible, but they're smaller than they seem to the eye. Normal lens approximates the way the eye sees space and size relationships. And telephoto lenses compress perspective, making elements appear closer to the foreground. Another factor contributing to depth of field relates to the focal distance. The distance from the camera to the subject, the focal distance, also has an effect on the depth of field. The closer the subject is to the camera lens, the more shallow the depth of field. The further away the subject is from the camera's lens, the greater the depth of field. In the first image, where the subject is close to the camera, you notice that there's a shallow depth of field. Conversely, in the second image, where the subject is quite distant, there's a broad depth of field going all the way from the foreground to the background of the picture.